I welcome you, and I'm pleased to introduce my colleague, Professor Fida Adely, this evening. Fida is Assistant Professor and the Maksoud Chair in Arab Studies here at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And among her published journal articles are the following titles: God Made Beautiful Things, Proper Faith and Religious Authority in a Jordanian High School. This was published in American Ethnologist. She's also another journal article is Women for Development, the Arab Human Development Report 2005 and the Problem with Women's Choices. This was published in IJMES. And she's also published an article entitled The Mixed Effects of Schooling for High School Girls in Jordan, the Case of Tal Yahya in the Comparative Education Review. So obviously we're hearing today an expert on women's education in the Arab world. And she's also published in a chapter in a book, a very popular book, by the way, for those of us who are interested in the sociology of education. This is Education in the Arab World, Political Project Struggles and Geometries of Power, edited by Andre Mazawi and Ronald Sultano. And Fida's chapter in that work is entitled Performing Patriotism, Rituals and Moral Authority in a Jordanian High School. And now I'm happy to report that Fida has just published her own textbook, which is available for sale outside. It's entitled Gendered Paradoxes. And in this book, she examines how young Jordanian women are facing the country's social and economic challenges. And she provides conclusions that contest conventional notions about women, education, and development in Jordan and in the larger Arab world. So without further delay, please join me in welcoming Professor Fida Adely.
Slides, but I'm gonna, there aren't that many, so I'm just gonna stand here rather than stand behind the podium. Yeah, actually, you're not. Oh, you need me to speak on a microphone? Okay. Sorry, so I'll stand up here. I'll try to be a proper presenter with my podium and those of you who know me know that I like to move around. But in any event, okay. So, gendered paradox, it's very difficult to think about what to say about a book that feels like your life's project up until now. I've gone on and I'm working on a number of other projects, but this feels like my first baby. And but I've figured out what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to just start a little bit by saying sort of how I came to do this project, and a little bit about my methodology, and then some of the primary themes of the book, and then read some passages. I should actually on the text. And I was just saying that I had debated sharing the original cover that the publisher had proposed to me, but I didn't bring it because it says a lot about sort of the issues that I had with the original cover. Say a lot about what I'm attempted to do here in the book in terms of representations of Arab Muslim women. So why did I become interested in this? The book is essentially an ethnography, and it's really grounded in school-based ethnography, but builds its way out, sort of thinking about schooling and education as both a national project and a global project. But the meat of it is really sort of focused on the day in and day out of a girls' high school in Jordan. And so, as I was beginning my graduate work in anthropology and education, I started my PhD in the fall of 2002, right? So it was right after, actually I started my graduate work in, was it 2001? In any event, it was right after 9/11. And after 9/11, there was quite a bit of discussion and interest in education in the Arab Muslim world. And it became a central concern of policymakers and researchers in the United States in particular because of the presumed links between education and extremism. And so there was quite a bit of writing and discussion about education at the time. But there was and most of the work that was produced in that era, even in the past decade really, was almost entirely focused on textbooks and textbook analysis. And so it was essentially equating what was in textbooks with education in the region. And so one of the reasons or this is one of the reasons that I decided to do more school-based kind of ethnographic research, because having spent a lot of time in schools in my lifetime, I knew that a lot more went on in schools than what was in the textbook. And I knew that I probably didn't remember much of what was in my textbooks. I mean, I remembered some of what was in there, but that this hardly captured the full extent of what was going on in schools. And so at that particular historical moment, it felt particularly important to me. The other reason is, before I decided, I was in a program of education, but I was more interested in kind of traditional development initiatives. And so initially I thought, I'm going to look at kind of gender and education development projects in the region and foreign aid funded projects. But I started looking at some data, and I knew I wanted to do more research in Jordan, but I was looking at data for the region and in Jordan in particular, and found, most girls were finishing school, were getting through high school. And this was a relatively new phenomena in Jordan, and so what exactly was going on in school and what significance did that space have in their lives? And that's sort of what drove me to begin doing the research. And I began with sort of just some exploratory research in a small town in Jordan, a town of about 7,000 people. And I spent 2 months there. It's about an hour from Amman, although everything in Jordan is about an hour from Amman. And so I spent a couple of months there, and I was sort of began to explore some of these issues. I spent 6 weeks in the school and then interviewing families in this community, and then decided to continue along this path. And some of that research is built into this book too. And then I came back and did sort of a full academic year at a high school in a city of 60,000 people. And I spent, as I said, sort of day in and day out in the school. I attended classes, talked to students informally, but I also interviewed them. I interviewed teachers, and then I did a number of kind of family case studies. I probably interviewed something like 15 families, but then I had a number of families that I continued to correspond with and meet with whenever I came back to Jordan, and I went back 2 or 3 subsequent summers. And in addition to that, there are a handful of the girls, some who I first met in 2002 and some in 2005, who I'm still in touch with today. And a lot of them are on Facebook, and that helps me, which many of them weren't even on the internet then. So it's sort of nice to be able to keep up on the developments in their lives. And so there are a number of young women who have been able to kind of follow their trajectories 5 or 6 years out of high school, if not longer, because what year are we in now? Yeah, 6 or 7 years out of high school. So that just gives you some sense. And so the school-based stuff, as I said, involved being there every day, interviewing people and talking to people. But again, I was also interested in how schooling was being couched by the state, by families, as well as kind of global development discourse about women and the ways in which education figured into that. And so I was thinking about schools and education more broadly at these kind of 4 levels. School as an important space in the lives of young women. And for many of the young women, I'd say the majority of the young women amongst whom I was doing the work, really this was the only somewhat public space that they spent time in. Their time was spent between school and home, and there weren't many other places that they were spending time. So this is a pretty significant place in their lives. But also thinking about schools as local institutions. Even though they're state institutions, they're institutions that are embedded in local communities, and they reflect that in many of the issues and themes that I talk about in the text. The ways in which sort of local struggles for power, or local family conflicts, or local feelings of inferiority vis-a-vis the capital, how that also plays out in a state institution in its local context is also a focus of the book. On another level, too, they are state institutions, and there are very explicit kinds of goals that the state has for schools. And the textbooks reflect those goals on one level, what the state would like young people to learn. But there are often competing interests even among state actors in terms of what the goals are, pedagogical goals and socializing goals in school. And so the book really tries to examine some of these competing interests of the state and the sort of disconnect between kind of the ideal that the state has for schools and the goals, and what in fact actually happens with that, whether it's curriculum or whether it's state-led kind of, most of the extracurricular events are very state-oriented and state-orchestrated, and I'll talk a bit about that shortly. But sort of thinking about these schools as state institutions, part of a state discourse, as well as sort of explicit state policies. And then the centrality of education and women's education in particular in ideas about modernity and modernization and progress and today development. And there's a century or more of research on the ways in which women's education was central to colonial discourses about women's progress and the progress of nations in that region. But still, to this day, education is still seen as very central to women's development, society's development, as well as notions of women's empowerment. And I'll come back to each of those in a minute. And then finally, thinking about education as this project that is tied up with people's hopes and expectations. And this really came through to me clearly thinking about like the recent events in the region and some of the grievances that underlie a lot of the protests in the region, the kinds of expectations that educational projects have created for people in the region. And when those projects aren't fulfilled, what kinds of frustrations does that create? So thinking, and I really, most of the folks that I interviewed were kind of low to middle income, and it's really quite striking how central education figures into kind of the projects and narratives of communities who have few other resources, and how much hope is sort of placed on the educational project as a path of upward mobility. So, kind of building on those levels, the four kind of substantive chapters. I mean, I have a chapter where I talk more about the history of Jordan, the history of schooling, and kind of gender policies of the regime. But I, in the end, sort of end up focusing on these four themes because they're themes that really resonated with me. I mean, I spent a month or two in the school before I even asked questions, and I was just sort of observing. But I organized for the central chapters in the text around these themes, and I'm going to talk about each of them in turn. Did I leave my watch over there? Yes, I did. That's over here. Because I don't want to talk too long, because I'd like to entertain questions and read some passages too. Okay, so performing patriotism. So I already talked about some of this, but the idea of states as a site of state, schools as a site of state socialization, even inculcation. A lot of the literature on schooling in the Arab world, and Andre Mazawi, actually, who you just talked about, Osama, wrote one of the first articles that really resonated with me, and he essentially was critiquing the literature on Arab schooling and said it really treated schools as almost this black box, right? So this kind of very top-down projects of the state and that were largely framed as successful in inculcating and socializing young people. And even though much of the literature on education in other parts of the world had begun to critique this, in the Arab world there wasn't enough of sort of trying to think about the limits of the state's power vis-a-vis schools. So what I do here in this chapter, Performing Patriotism, is examine some of the multiple kinds of projects of the state. So there's a state curriculum, there's a history curriculum, there's a social studies curriculum, there's a civic ed curriculum, but there are also the initiatives, like national kinds of initiatives, Jordan First being sort of the biggest one while I was there, and the ways in which this national campaign that was meant to sort of rally people around Jordan's development and kind of put down any kind of divisive debate or discussion around issues like the invasion of Iraq, how this played out in school. And the state actually had quite explicit policies. They gave training to teachers about how they should convey the messages of this initiative in schools. And so there are ways in which it was visible in schools. But the most visible way, and I've written about this in other contexts other than the book, was the ways in which students, and female students in particular, were involved in performing at patriotic events. And most extracurricular activities were organized around patriotic events, the King's Birthday, Independence Day, Army Day, Tree Day, and then students, and I have one picture here of students practicing for one of these events, and students who performed in this, it wasn't a requirement to perform, although sometimes students were required to march or go to such performances. The performances were a self-selected group of students, but they created quite a bit of controversy because mostly on kind of moral and respectability grounds, people would criticize the students for participating in these events because of the kind of events, because of the kind of audience, and there were all these kind of moral religious debates about the respectability of girls who participated in such events. just as importantly, and this, I argue, sort of challenges the state's moral authority. The state sort of asks young people to participate in these things. The schools are required to have somebody participate in them, but it raises all sorts of questions about the moral authority of the state. At the same time, this sort of requirement that people participate equally raises issues, right? People are quite cognizant of the fact that they're being, in some cases, sort of forced to go along, to march, to participate in parades. And so the bulk of the chapter are sort of vignettes and little glimpses of how this plays out in school. And I'll just read one short passage related to this. So, okay, the subtitle of this section is called "We Are Still Singing and Dancing." It was late February of 2005, and a staff person from the local Ministry of Education had come to the school. He was sitting with some school administrators talking about the upcoming patriotic celebrations that he was helping to organize. I hadn't been there when he first arrived, so I asked about the nature of these celebrations. So I asked, "What is the occasion for these celebrations?" And he responded, "The king's birthday." And I sort of innocently responded, "But I thought his birthday was a few weeks ago." And he responded, "It was, but each government takes turns celebrating, and now it's our turn. We'll have a parade, and all the students will march." And then the school secretary, Bashira, said, "All of the girls?" And she's responding to the staff person, "Can't we just send some of them out? They won't all go out anyway. They'll say that their parents won't allow it." So I asked, "What do you do in this case?" And Bashira responded, "Well, we know which girls are telling the truth because we know their families," which not entirely true. It was actually quite a large school, 500 girls, so she didn't really know all of them intimately. But some of them lied to try and get out of marching, but we have marches frequently. Last spring, we had a march in support of the king after a terrorist plot was uncovered in Jordan and the suspects were arrested. The king gave a speech, and after these events, and the march was to show support for him. So who calls for such marches, I asked. The ministry in Amman, the Ministry of Education. At this point, the staff person from the ministry office, who appeared quite uncomfortable with this conversation, left abruptly, and another teacher chimed in and said, "There'll be an event at the municipal hall to celebrate the king's birthday as well. The Ministry of Education office here calls up and requests that we send students to such events. Do you have similar celebrations and holidays in the US?" And I said, "Yes, we do, but maybe less than here, or maybe it's less overt." And I have a footnote kind of qualifying that, but I won't read you the footnote. And so she said, "So you have progressed. You are past the phase of singing and dancing." So this just gives you a sense of some of those kinds of issues in the text. In the next chapter, I deal kind of more explicitly about with issues of religious education, not necessarily just in religion class, but sort of the different ways in which people are trying to educate each other about religion in the school. And in that chapter, I frame this as kind of struggles over religious authority, the authority of the teacher versus the authority of the text in the state, and the authority of different individuals within the school who are somehow situating themselves as experts vis-a-vis other folks. What was really striking to me was, well, this year, and it wasn't always the case at the school, the year that I was there was quite an active prayer room committee. There was a prayer room on campus where girls can go pray. And there was an active prayer room committee who would offer lessons at lunchtime. And there was this very dynamic and charismatic young woman, 16, who was a junior in high school, who was the head of the committee. And she herself was quite religious and involved in dawah, religious organization outside of school that was involved in kind of preaching. She was involved in preaching to other Muslims about being other Muslims, about being better Muslims. And it was considered, even by those in the own community, a pretty conservative interpretation of Islam. For example, a lot of the folks involved in the Dawah movement thought women should cover their face, which wasn't typical in Jordan ever, but it's becoming more widespread in part because of Dawah movement. So, and Amina, who was the head of the prayer committee, was one of 2 or 3 girls who covered her face in the school. In any event, it's not because she covers her face that she's so significant. It's because she's constantly preaching. Every moment she's given a break between classes. And so she is kind of this authority to some of her peers. Not all of her peers took her seriously. But what was interesting is this kind of quiet dynamic that unfolded between her and the religion teacher, who thought she was too conservative, and without explicitly calling her out, would kind of in religion class say things about some people say you should do, and then the religion teacher would sort of say that that's not really true, that's too conservative, that's too extreme. And so there's this ongoing dialogue between them. And what was also, so this is part of the ways in which this kind of debate or kind of struggles over authority played out in school. And what was also interesting to me are that the prayer room committee were really left to their own devices in a context where all other extracurricular activities were really state-directed and state-monitored. They were kind of left to their own devices because it was seen as benign. The girls are getting together to pray, and this can't be anything but a good thing in the sense of sort of keeping the girls involved in positive activities at school. But they were really sort of left to organize their own events with very little intervention from anyone else. And I think in part it's because they were just girls and they were seen as kind of not threatening in that sense. But they were also, again, seen as sort of a good influence on other girls who might be like not following the school rules or acting out. The religion, and I'll just say the other main focus of this chapter, so I talk a lot about Amina and her interaction with her peers in the text. The other focus is religion classes. And the one teacher who was kind of unofficially debating Amina, Ms. Suhail, was really kind of a surprise to me because, we often think of, or at least my assumption was that religion would be kind of this space of indoctrination, which it can often be, just sort of a place where young people learn doctrine, they learn to memorize passages from the Quran. But Ms. Suhail was really kind of an interesting character. She had studied, she was doing her PhD in education, and she was reading quite a bit about different pedagogical methods. And so she was, as someone who studied education, by any standard, sort of really interested in what we would consider here in the US kind of progressive pedagogical methods. She was using role play, small group activity, in a school in which most of the learning was quite traditional. And so she was using all these progressive, it's considered progressive education, I'm putting quotes around it, but that's the way it's referred to within education, progressive education kind of techniques. At the same time, she sort of had a philosophy. She was a deeply religious woman, but had a philosophy that people needed to be engaged in kind of a productive way, and that these were young people, they had many interests, they had many influences, you couldn't force them to believe anything, you needed to engage them in discussion, and it was sort of a very intellectual, as sort of pedagogically rooted kind of philosophy that she had about the approach to this. And she also saw the kind of religion that Amina was preaching, or tradition. She saw other kind of interpretations of religion as problematic, particularly vis-a-vis women and gender. And so she was constantly talking to the young women about how they could be anything and they could do anything and they shouldn't listen to these kinds of traditional, these ignorant kinds of traditions, and they could be doctors and they could be this and that. So she was constantly giving them pep talks, trying to engage them and sort of thinking for themselves. And so she was really quite remarkable, and of all the teachers in the school was the most popular for this reason, and also the most engaging. And so I decided I needed to sit in on another religion teacher's class as well. And I'll say one thing, that part of what allowed Ms. Suhail to do this in her class is that her class was one that was kind of like, sort of Islam in your life. And so even the text was trying to relate religion to things like work, family, I'm trying to think of something, charitable, voluntarism. And so the text was trying to link things to kind of real world questions and issues. The text was much more conservative than she was in the ways that it was trying to make these links. And so I decided to go sit in on another class of another teacher, Miss Jude, who seemed to me sort of much more traditional, both in her approach of teaching and in her perspective about how young people should approach the learning of religion. And it was much more about sort of, you just need to accept this is what our religion says. But even in the space of that class, it was sort of interesting to see how young women challenged her. And a lot of the reason why they challenged her, she was a new teacher and she wasn't very confident. And so these kind of funny dynamics that happen. She's trying to be authoritative. She has a much more kind of black and white view about religion, but they still sort of, I kind of think of it as like played with her. So I'm going to read a passage from one of her classes, a passage about her classes. So I observed 14 of Miss Jude's religion classes and spoke with her on a number of occasions. One thing I noticed at Miss Jude's class is that she often began class by asking the girls to cover their hair. Some of the students wore headscarves only outside of schools and had headscarves with them. Some of the girls responded by covering their hair, but others disregarded her, and some didn't even have a headscarf to begin with. In some classes, such as an unruly group of 11th graders, she didn't even broach the topic. The 10th graders had the best rapport with Miss Jude, and the students liked her. Although she wasn't always the most engaging teacher, she was kind. One day, I joined a group of 10th graders for a lesson on moderation in Islam. The lesson in the textbook began, God made the Islamic community the best community, distinguishing it with the perfect law and the soundest method, and made the community moderate. What is moderation then? This is the quote, end of quote from the text. The opening statement is followed by a Quranic verse related to the lesson. The remainder of the lesson in the text, that is, addresses moderation in one's belief, in law, in spending, eating, drinking, etc. So drawing on the lesson, Ms. Jude begins a discussion about what moderation means for religious practice in one's life. So she asked the class, what does moderation in Islam mean? And Ibtisam responds to her, you should not just pray all the time and do nothing else. Ms. Jude says, yes, and you need to take care of your body. Islam makes adjustments for those with physical limitations, so a traveler does not have to fast, nor does a pregnant woman. You need to take care of your body and spirit, and zakat puts you at ease, but even zakat should be moderate. We should also show moderation in other ways, she says. We should show respect for our teachers and not overdo our friendliness. It's overdoing it when you start calling teachers by nicknames like Tutu. And so Lena says, Miss, that means you would be Juju. And then so this kind of teasing goes back and forth. So her reference to moderation, this is my interpretation, in teacher-student relations, perhaps stemmed from her own efforts to assert authority in the classroom as a new teacher. Shortly after Miss Jude discussed the importance of not being too friendly with one's teachers, Dima got up from her seat to throw something out in the wastebasket, and as she proceeded to walk by Miss Jude's desk, she pinched her cheek. The class all laughed. Now, can you imagine this? The class all laughed at this excessive friendliness, and even Miss Jude couldn't contain her smile. The students were comfortable with Miss Jude, perhaps too comfortable in her own view. So I'm just trying to give us a flavor of what the classroom felt like. So this was a teacher who was clearly more rigid than Miss Suhail, but there was all this sort of playing around with her. And one day, another student they had a lesson on kind of free will and destiny, and one of the students was like, well, I don't understand. How could you have free will if God knows what's going to happen? And they went back and forth and back and forth. And then Miss Jude finally said, you have too many questions. And the teacher was like, but God will favor you if you answer our questions, as the student said. And they're just sort of all back and forth. So it's just to give us a flavor. Again, I think that this is kind of not what we expect in a religious class. And I don't tell these stories to say that these are typical of anything, but just to say that these are possible kind of interactions in a religion classroom where the text, which is much more limited in what it's conveying. This is so much about the teachers and the students in this context, and it's also about the administration of the school and any number of other things going on that day. So, okay, so making girls into respectable women is the next chapter, and in that chapter I really kind of look at less religion per se, but kind of just more general lessons about what it means to be a good woman, good girl, and the kinds of debates about that. And I organize this around the sort of imperative of keeping boys and girls apart, and sex segregation, and kind of, this is all the schools, all high schools in Jordan, or all public schools are sex segregated. And in this school, all the teachers are female. Maybe there are one or two male teachers who are part-time teachers who come in to teach particular classes. So they're sex segregated, and they're sort of generally in the community that I was in, which is a bit different than some parts of Amman. Men and women really don't just sort of hang out with each other, and particularly at this age, at high school, is when young women are sort of beginning to be told that they need to, be concerned about their respect, their reputation, their honor, and and that can be compromised by interacting with a non-relative, a male non-relative. Having said that, there are boys outside the school gates almost every day, and the principal is personally trying to deter them from coming on campus. And a large majority of the girls talk about nothing but boys. And it's really kind of striking, striking to me, I should say. I mean, I'm the one who's surprised, because I grew up as a Jordanian American in the United States, and I had sort of very rigid views about what the possibilities were in Jordan, because that's the way I was sort of taught it here, and it was taught as sort of very separate from American culture. And of course, living and working in Jordan since my childhood, I've learned there's a lot more variety and nuance, but it was just sort of interesting to be with these young girls, and some days just think, wow, this is like I went to an all-girls high school in the States. This feels like high school. Like just the kind of drama around, well, you looked at this boy and I looked at that boy. So on the one hand, amongst the girls, there's quite a bit of discussion about this, although not all the girls. Some of the girls think this is dishonorable, this is not acceptable, but at the same time, there are many girls sort of talking about this. Most don't have any kind of relationship with boys, but they see boys, they talk about them, they text them. And then the teachers really are moderating a lot of this in some sense, right? Because they're talking to the girls about what they should and shouldn't be doing, and they're saying, be careful about boys who try to trick you to do X. And so there's all this kind of like trying to interpret things and guide the girls that go on at school. At the same time, it can be quite kind of disciplinary too. Girls, in one incident, a girl is seen off campus, like outside the school with a boy, and the principal calls her into the office, and there's this kind of policing of their activity outside of school that could happen in school, because the worry is she's supposed to be on her way to school, her behavior is going to be associated with the school. The worry is also we don't want her to get in trouble. What will her parents think if she's supposed to be at school and she's off doing this? And so there's all this sort of competing stuff going on. But at the same time, you know, the girls are adolescent girls, and they like soap operas, and I listen to love songs, and so there's all this kind of love talk. One of my favorite lines from the book, it's just a short one, or one of my favorite incidences is, all right, some of this love talk. So one day, Janine, an 11th grader, comes up to me, and she has an entourage of 7 or 8 friends clinging to each other, and she has this dreamy-eyed kind of look in her face, and she says, Miss Fida, do they love in America? And I laughed, thinking, as I did many times while at al-Khatwa, that there was so much that was similar to being a high school girl in Jordan and being one in the United States. And I said, yes, do they love in Jordan? And she replied in turn, yes, that's all we do. So this just give you a sense of something just kind of like day-to-day way in which the girls are thinking about these issues. You know, it's not all, I mean, there are, as I said, moments in which the girls can get into serious trouble for getting into relationships that the school finds out about. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes girls are in relationships and they're sort of quietly being sanctioned because the hope is that it will lead to marriage, because there's no real dating in this community as we would think about it here. There's kind of maybe quiet getting to know each other before marriage. But in one incident, one of the girls wants to get engaged to this soldier that she's been kind of quietly eyeing for months who works near her house. And the teachers are appalled because she's in 10th grade. So these are all, and the teachers are all local community women, I should say. They're all products of the local schools. So they're not teachers coming from Amman. And so they think, no, this is crazy. You know, you shouldn't be thinking about getting engaged now. At the very least, finish high school first. So most of the time, that's what the teachers are saying to young women. The other thing I'm going to say, so the respectability kind of discussion is a lot about boy-girl interaction, marriage, and you know who appropriate marriage partners might be, and the kind of discussions that happen in school. But it's also really tied up with being educated too, respectability for women. And this is something, again, which is, you know, not entirely new, but being educated is very important for their status as women in Jordan today. And it was maybe in an earlier time, or at least this is what people say, that being too educated could be problematic for a woman, but that trend has really begun to shift. And even if a woman doesn't intend to work, her educational status is still important in terms of marriage, and I'll talk about that more in terms of sort of the education for what question. But I'll just say that the way in which the school is structured, this really plays out, the kind of education, the respectability and education link. The schooling is very tracked, right? So after 10th grade, kids are tracked vocational ed, or they're tracked in kind of like a humanities track, or they're tracked into math and science. And since I did my research, there's now kind of like an IT track. And I don't know really how people feel about it. It was still fairly new when I was there. And the girls who are in the science track are the smartest girls, but they're also considered to be the most kind of moral and respectable girls. And the girls in humanities are kind of in the middle, and the girls in vocational education have this reputation of being kind of loose and not serious. And it's funny, not everybody talks in these terms, but it's funny that it played out in the school, right? So the kids in humanities were loud, and they're less smart, right? Because they've got lower grades, and that's why they're in the humanities track. For the most part, very few people downshift, and you can't upshift. And so somehow their kind of lack of studiousness and lack of success at schools is associated with bad behavior. So sometimes it's just bad behavior in the sense of she doesn't study, she's lazy, and so this kind of behavior is associated with educational achievement. And then it's sort of rigidly tracked. And the kids complained about it. The humanities kids would complain that the teachers always had sort of thought badly of them, and they only respected the science students. And then the vocational ed school had even a worse reputation. It was kind of considered the dumping ground for kids who just couldn't succeed, at best. At worst, kids who were interested in things outside of school, and at very worst, kind of like immoral things, and that this completely distracted them from doing their work. And there was a teacher who had worked at vocational school who essentially said they're not smart enough to know what to do, what's right. And but in the school it played out more in terms of sort of favoritism. And to the school's, sort of defense, the humanities kids were off the wall. I mean, so they played up to this, they fulfilled the expectations of the teachers, but there was a 11th grade class which was completely out of control most of the time, and nobody could teach them. And so they kind of fulfilled these kind of low expectations of their teachers by just giving the teachers a hard time. But to me, the whole notion that education is increasingly tied up with one's respectability as a woman in kind of long-term terms, like marriageability, but even in short-term terms, this is very much kind of rigidified to a tracking system in which these kind of insinuations are tied to like different teaching. And even in the United States, I did some research, like vocational ed was seen as kind of the dumping ground for poor kids, working class kids, kind of dead end. It was a dead end space, and it still is in many places. And so it has this history of kind of absorbing the failures or the poor kids or the kids who are not educationally successful. And that was the history of vocational ed in the US as well. Okay, so I'm going on too long. I'm not going to leave time for questions. So finally, and this will get us to my discussion of the title. The final chapter tries to come back to this question of sort of education for what. And in that chapter, I really I look at some of the development discourse about Jordan and about Arab women's education in general. I also look at the literature on education. Again, there's a long and historical narrative about the importance of education for women. And in development, there's sort of a lot of corollary between things like positive health outcomes and education, although fertility, infant mortality, although the data is actually quite mixed vis-a-vis fertility. But for some time now, we've associated education with important health outcomes and kind of broader positive impacts for society. And so women's education was seen as not just central for women, but central for their communities, for their families. And around the time that I was in Jordan, or around the end of this first group of research, these are two reports that I kind of reviewed, but the World Bank report did a gender assessment around the time that I was there, and some of you may have heard this already, so if you have, I apologize. But they did a gender assessment, and they essentially, and this is where my title comes from, refer to Jordan as a gender paradox, and the paradox being that women have these high rates of education, but they have too many children, and they don't enter the labor force at the rate that we would expect them to enter. So I was asked to go speak to this youth group, an Islamic youth group that had some of the kids from the school in it, in the community that I was working in. This report had just come out, and since these kids don't often read reports that are written about them, I decided to just talk with them a bit about this report. And when I talked with them, I gave the presentation, and the central message of the report, the one that I conveyed to the young women, is this paradox. And after I explained to them what the paradox was, I opened the floor for discussion, and one young woman raised her hand, and she asked, why doesn't the World Bank consider it a good thing that we can have high levels of education with high fertility? And she said, now I should say that the fertility has actually decreased significantly in Jordan and in the region overall. But so fertility rates are actually going down, but this report was framed as sort of persistent high fertility, persistent low labor force participation. And the very first response I got was this, and then I thought a lot about this because we always assume that lower fertility is a good thing. And I just thought, given the centrality, and I'm just going to read from the text, given the centrality of kin relations in accomplishing almost any task in Jordan, official or otherwise, and the status accorded to families, mothers, this comment wasn't surprising, although it was rarely represented in these kind of reports. And yet this perspective wasn't uniform across this group of young women either. A debate ensued about what was good for women, men, families, and the overall well-being of the community, with some young women drawing upon religious references, others not, and much of the debate ended up focusing on the purpose of education and the desirability of women's work outside the home. So sort of my brief summary of this report prompted this debate and discussion. And so in the end, that's where my title really comes from, thinking about why women's education is framed as paradoxical, and what other kinds of things are happening in schools that are important for these young women, and also the kind of surprises that I found myself in my own assumptions, so the sort of needing to be educated to marry well, but also that some women are marrying so that they can finish their education because their families can't afford to educate them, so they marry someone who agrees to pay for them to finish college. So this is the unexpected kind of flip for this. Or working, the dominant kind of discourse now is that most men want to marry working women because of the economic situation, this despite the persistently low labor force participation rates. But you also want to be able to work in case you don't get married. So there's so many kind of dimensions to thinking about the relationship between education and marriage for people. And then in the end, the ways in which education is important, not just for a woman's status, but her family status. And I'm going to read one woman's story in a moment. I just want to give you, here are some of the young women from school. And so I want to conclude with a few thoughts, and then I'm going to read a story about one of these young women. But so as I started by saying, there was very little research in schools, and I just wanted to kind of just complicate our understanding of schools as local institutions, as important space in young people's lives. And that was sort of one of my goals with this, as well as try to complicate our understanding of what the lives of young women like this might be. And again, my editor sent me a picture of a woman wearing kind of like 18th century Islamic clothing, wearing sunglasses, and she thought this was great because the sunglasses were paradoxical. And I said, but this is like 18th century clothing from like Central Asia. And anyway, when I convinced her it wasn't appropriate, she said, well, how about we just get a picture, like of a woman in a hijab wearing sunglasses, because that's really, or like high heels. And I thought, but women wear high heels and sunglasses and hijab all the time. And I mean, so I just felt like, even though this is a discussion, particularly in anthropology, but in many fields we've had sort of the problems of representation of women in the region, it's still a persistent problem. So I feel like this is just one more contribution to both, complicating the lives of these young women. I mean, these women definitely face many constraints in their lives, and education wasn't always sort of a positive thing, although it could be. But I try to point to get us thinking beyond the kind of straight cultural constraints and think about things like geography, family history. The experience of an older sibling could completely change the trajectory for a young woman. If her older sibling failed and then never married because she didn't get an education, this might push the family to like take out loans to make sure she finished her education. I mean, there's so much kind of detail and nuance that goes into the decision making about young women's education. And I also wanted to make sure that people understood, that people laughed and made fun and poked fun at their teachers, because I feel like that's important for us to remember in thinking about these issues. I'll say that there's a number of issues that emerged in my research that I think really need to be considered, and these are more kind of specifically about education, considered further. There's a slowly growing gender gap in Jordan, and the gap is sort of girls outnumbering and outperforming boys. And it's a gap we're seeing in many different contexts around the globe for different reasons. And we're also seeing it to an extent in some Gulf countries. And in the community I was in, I would go talk to parents and say, tell me about your girl's education. And they'd say, my girl's doing just fine. Let me tell you about my son, who refuses to take his exams, whose school is horrible, whose teachers beat him up, and he beats up the teacher. I mean, so in this community, there was a lot of violence at the schools. But then this was confirmed for me, like in the capital, people who I knew working with NGOs that were working with schools. So there's a persistent, in the Jordanian case, a real issue between the public schools, boys and girls, in terms of the quality of education being delivered, but also males, the attitude of males towards school, and the increasing pressure on males from low-income families to leave school and work, which, at least in the Jordanian case, is not acceptable. The kind of menial labor that most men might do. For girls, it's not acceptable. So if a girl does well in school, she can make a case for staying in school. If she doesn't do well in school, that's another story, but I can answer questions about that. And the other thing is quality gaps. Right now, 35% of people in the capital send their kids to private school. And so increasingly the public schools are being abandoned. And so there's a sort of 3-tiered, 4-tiered school system. And so even though, and outside of the capital, everybody's in public schools, but So this equality issue is becoming sort of more than just a public school, but it's becoming this, anyone who considers themselves slightly above kind of working class believes they must send their children to private school. And they're not all great schools either, but there's sort of a real kind of quality disparity that's growing. And finally, again, the sort of political implications of the unmet expectations. I saw families really kind of take on a lot of debt and just make kind of Herculean efforts to educate their daughters as well as their sons. And their expectation of their daughters are going to be able to help them, their daughters are going to marry well, their daughters are going to have a better life than they did. And I feel like a lot of sort of the grievances that are being expressed in Jordan now are about the kind of unmet expectations tied up with education. So I'm actually not going to read another quote because I've talked enough. I'm just going to leave it there and open it up for questions. So.
Thank you very much for that.
That's no problem.
The floor is open to questions.
Joseph.
Hi. You talked before the first point about patriotism. And you mentioned the history books. How do the history books, the textbooks, portray major events, be it the June 1967 war or the assassination of King Abdullah? Was there discussion in classes of these events?
Not much at all. And I should qualify that by saying that I didn't do a systematic review of textbooks. I decided that my start was going to be the school, and then when the text came up, I would reference the text. But there have actually been a couple of really good articles written about history texts, and I did look at the text somewhat. But there's very little history. And it's sort of the history of the Hashemite family. There's kind of Islamic history. There's very little contemporary history. There used to be a class called the Palestine Problem, and after the peace treaty, after the peace treaty, they stopped teaching it. So there's very little. What you have now is kind of like you have a civic ed curriculum that talks about things like what forms of government are there, and what does this form of government look like, what does that form of government look like. But it's mostly kind of a history of the Hashemites and a very kind of simplified history of the Arab Revolution, and then here we are, we have Jordan, and yeah. Yep.
Just in looking at pedagogy and how teachers apply the textbook, what did you see as far as teachers kind of going offline from the rote lessons?
Yeah. I have to say that, for at least a decade now, teachers have been getting training about not doing rote learning, about doing problem solving, but the high school completion exam still heavily relies on that rote learning. So even teachers who would want to teach differently feel sort of beholden to the text because they know that the text is the curriculum and that's what students will be tested on. I mean, I think that this is beginning to change slightly, and there's sort of a lot of effort to think about how to change it. But until these very kind of high stakes exams change, the teachers feel like it would be a disservice not to make sure that the kids haven't memorized what's in the text. Having said that, in classes now I sat in on all subjects, and then I decided I didn't need to sit in on physics and math and Arabic any longer. That there actually were, in classes that weren't as high stakes in terms of the exam, like civic education, 10th grade civic education, the content wasn't necessarily going to be on a high school exam, completion exam. There actually was quite a bit of discussion and debate. Not necessarily always initiated by the teacher. Sometimes. And in another social studies class, there was a teacher who was kind of more political and critical, and so she was the one who said we're still singing and dancing, and she was a social studies teacher, and so she would make remarks. She'd make remarks about the Palestine issue. She'd make remarks about imperialism. I mean, she would talk about these kinds of things. And the religion teacher was always linking things to everyday life. Some people in this society, or they'd critique TV. It's amazing how much TV is the substance of lessons in school too, because either someone's saying, don't listen to what you've seen on TV, or someone's sort of citing something they've seen on TV. So I also see school as a place in which this stuff kind of gets mediated, debated. But yeah, most of the teaching seemed pretty traditional to me, but that's part of the reason why, I would think. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Karen?
Well, elsewhere in the Middle East, at least, I don't know much about Jordanian history. Schools have also been a site for kind of political mobilization, either teachers unions, or students.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering to what extent that is something that you saw, not in instruction, but in the sort of space of the school and the sociability that happens in school. And
Yeah.
about sort of state investment in education, teacher strikes, things like that.
So when I was there, the only overt kind of challenge, and it wasn't even so overt, was more conservative, right? It was sort of like, this regime is like religiously, it was never explicit, but by critiquing things like state patriotic performances as against Islam, and it was sort of an implicit critique of the regime's own kind of moral authority. But since then, actually, the teachers were at the center of protests, which began in late 2010, demanding the right to unionize. They shut down the schools twice in 2011, and they have now since gotten the right to a union. And so teachers have been very active, and they were at political protests. So they weren't just at kind of their teacher protests. They were in political protests in downtown Amman. I imagine some high school students have been involved in that kind of thing, but there's been no organization of high school students. What was funny, in 2011, I was in Jordan doing some work with the Arab Spring, is that all these kids started organizing protests around things like and it was all over the news, school and Hayy al-Nizal organize a protest because they don't want their principal anymore. And so they were kind of emulating Arab Spring. And then, so one group of students organized a protest because a teacher that they liked was fired. And so there was all this kind of, but I don't know what's come of it. I mean, there's a university student movement that's been active for some time. And the high schools historically were the center of kind of nationalist, anti-regime kind of activity. Betty Anderson wrote a great book about that, Nationalist Voices, where she talks about schools as the site of some of that activity. But I don't know, I mean, it's a completely different country right now than it was in 2005 in many ways. I mean, the kinds of things, like we're still singing and dancing was kind of a brave critique. But I went back to the school, I'll just tell this one story. I went back to the school in June, and I saw some of my friends at the school, and I said, how are things going? I was talking to the guidance counselor, and she was like, terrible. It's like, the kids are just out of control, and they think because of this Arab Spring that they can do whatever they want. And so this was but at the same time, she was kind of tongue-in-cheek, because she's involved in this political movement, or her husband is, and she is, and they have these meetings at her house, and right around that time, so I didn't get a chance to talk to them about their own involvement in the teacher union, but it's just a different context. Like, people are openly critical in a way that they just weren't when I was there, unless they knew me well. And not everybody was critical either. So, yeah.
Thank you for this rich
Jeremy.
material. I look forward to reading the whole book. There are many directions we could go with this, I'm sure, but just two questions, comments. First, I'd love it if you expand a bit on your understanding of the relationship and implications of the relationship between public and private schooling, and the implications of private schooling. I take it that's probably a relatively recent development in Jordan. I'm not entirely sure. And understanding that you didn't do field work at a private school as well, but do you expect that the paradoxes you're exploring regarding gender, citizenship, and religion would be similarly played out there? And then secondly, this term that just sort of lodged in my mind as you were talking was indoctrination. I don't know if this is going to emerge as a question or not, but it strikes me, so indoctrination seems to frequently be used in a rather dismissive, polemical way to frame a pedagogical relationship as merely an instrumental power relationship, right? And it can be applied in that sense both to states and religions. States and religions are both taken to be these indoctrinating entities that you can think of state ideological apparatuses or perhaps religious ideological apparatuses. In your discussion of the religion class, you really got a sense in which indoctrination in that sense is not sufficient understanding the sort of education and relationships occurring in that context. I was wondering if you might say a bit about nationalism in that regard. Is it similarly complicated in these contexts vis-a-vis this issue of indoctrination?
Yeah, sure. So on the private-public question, this is relatively new in Jordan. I mean, there have always been a handful of kind of very elite schools, a handful of Christian schools, but this is a real sort of mushrooming of the private sector, and I think it's sort of indicative of another kind of, other kinds of shifts that are happening. Amman is a dramatically different city than I lived in Amman 93 to 95. And it's so much more, I mean, to use cliched kind of words, global, cosmopolitan. There's sort of a very kind of West-oriented part of Amman. There's a huge expat community as a result of, U.S. involvement in Iraq, because Jordan was a base for that. And now with all the refugees that Jordan has, a slew of NGOs coming through town. And so some of this is the kind of money that comes in as a result of that, as well as money that came in after the first Gulf War from returnees, so folks with Jordanian citizenships, but most of them who had never lived in Jordan, who were kicked out of the Gulf, and as well as Iraqis, because some of the first Iraqis who came to Jordan were quite wealthy. So there was all this money that went into real estate, investment, and so there's this really sort of elite class and a kind of degree of conspicuous consumption that's just unprecedented in my experience in Jordan. But part of this is these kind of schools that are meeting the needs of this class, largely English language schools. So this is like a language issue which other countries in the region maybe have seen before, but again in Jordan is relatively new, to have a class of kids who don't read and write in Arabic and barely speak in Arabic, and a class of people who speak English day to day, and they hire domestic servants from other countries who speak English to their children. So it's a whole shift that maybe was happening amongst kind of the elite in other countries in the region that seems to me pretty new in Jordan. Yeah, and the gendered implications of that, I'll just say one thing. It was interesting, there were two private schools actually in the city that I was in, an Islamic school and a Christian school, like a Catholic Melechite school. And there were many more boys at both schools. And when I asked parents about it, they'd say, well, the girls' schools are perfectly good, the boys' schools are awful, and this is my one chance to not lose my son in the educational process. But this is what the parents said, but this may also reflect another kind of bias. And in fact, the public high schools were considered sort of better in 11th and 12th grade for your chances of passing the high school completion exam. And these are not elite private schools, so they were seen as kind of safer spaces in the sense that the boys would have more discipline and more control, which the feeling was that the girls had that at the public schools and they didn't need it. How this plays out in the kind of more elite schools in terms of the gender makeup, I'm not sure. And there's quite a range. There are some super elite schools, and then there are a lot of kind of mediocre. Sometimes, again, the public schools are probably better, but the fear is, the class sizes are huge in the public schools. I mean, this is one huge problem. 60 kids in a first grade classroom, 70 kids in some cases, and your other question about indoctrination and nationalism. I don't know. I mean, I was in a part of the country which was considered kind of, royalists and loyalists, right? And I have always had a hard time sort of teasing these things out, because I have to say, quite honestly, I know too many people who aren't royalists. But teasing my own kind of interactions with folks and that. But my sense at the school was that, I mean, with the kids, it's very hard to understand how this is affecting them, right? Because they're 16, and for the most part, they don't care about these things. So there may be one or two kids who care about what goes on in Palestine and Iraq, and they try to get their friends to take that seriously. But most of them really, are more interested in like the most recent soap opera or some crisis in their own more immediate life. And so for the young and the kids who participated in music, I hardly got the sense that this was any kind of patriotic duty. It was like, wow, this is fun. I get to get out of class. I get to perform. I get to travel to other schools. So it's hard to know what the sort of longer term impact is on young people. Although I will say that there's been a dramatic shift in the country in the past year and a half in terms of what people will say about the regime publicly. And was that just created overnight? I mean, all these sort of red lines about what you're allowed to say have been broken. I mean, almost broken. 12 people were arrested last week for pushing it. At a protest, the government says they said something which was anti-king, so. My guess is it's an incomplete project, just as religion is. But these things are hard to trace. But I saw it being challenged in very kind of implicit ways in the school. So, Osama? Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody else had a hand up for that too. Sorry. No, go.
After you. I just wanted to know if there was any sort of college counseling service available
Mm-hmm.
at the high school, and if you thought that the school as a whole encouraged their students to pursue higher education,
Yeah.
or whether that choice was left to the families and the young women themselves.
So there's a way in which this kind of very rigid system answers that question for about 80% of the students, because you can't go to college unless you get a certain score on the high school completion exam, unless you're super wealthy and can go abroad, which in the city I was in was not really an option. For maybe very few could go abroad to like other Arab countries where it would be inexpensive. So basically, everyone I talked to, with the exception of maybe one family, wanted, assumed, and just said, yes, my daughter's going to university, but no one can go to university unless they get a certain score on the high school completion exam, and that score determines what they can study and which university they can go to. So the schools don't really have a role except to sort of encourage them to study and do well, but the students don't even find out till July or August after their senior year what university they've been accepted into, if they've even been accepted. Something like 40% of the students who take the exam pass it, but passing is not enough to get into a public university. I will say that the top 10 performers this year were female, and the majority of the top performers on this exam have been female for the last few years. But there was a huge controversy this year because when someone finally pointed this out and said, why are the girls doing so much better than the boys? The Minister of Education said, they're trying to escape housework. And that's why they're kind of and this created a huge controversy. I mean, he should have been fired, but he wasn't. But it created a huge controversy, and he was sort of reprimanded. But no one's really, they're just beginning to pay attention to this. And I don't know what the implications will be for young women. Affirmative action for young men, maybe. I don't know. But, so yeah, there's not a role per se. It's more kind of an impersonal, like you should study, you shouldn't. The only time I said when that one girl was wanted to get engaged, and she didn't end up getting engaged. And most of her teachers said, no, this is silly, you're too young, at least wait till you finish high school. The only teacher who didn't say that was her homeroom teacher, and said, she's not the studying type. You know, if she likes this guy, she should just get married. So, but this is just indicative of an added, and because of the tracking system, and because of the reality that unless you do well, you're not going to go to university. Students who don't do well, even themselves, might make the calculation that it's not worth it. Why continue to I'm never going to pass this exam? As do some of the boys. Some of the boys make the same calculation, but they say, I'm going to go work. I'm not going to keep doing this. So, yeah, but it's quite rigid. Osama?
Yeah, I want to go back to your answer to Jeremy's question. Because
Yeah.
one thing that was in my mind as you were giving your presentation is that how is this different from what's happening in boys' schools? But more importantly, at the level of performance, because it seems to me like the way you're describing the performances, there seems to be some tension there between public action, or at least action in public space,
Yeah.
and some kind of moral probity measure of what's
Yeah.
allowed or not. And I'm sure that for the boys it must be completely different.
Surprisingly, yeah. Okay, you have another question, yeah. Yeah.
Because I may not get another chance. So the other thing is, if you look at the other definition of performance is we know that performance in school is not necessarily always a direct relation with intellectual
Yeah.
vocabulary. So a lot of it has to do with social standing, networking, etc. So is there any kind of old Marxian class analysis here that can explain how these girls are assessed as being of looser morals versus
Yeah.
moral?
Yeah.
And then finally,
You said two questions. That's
good.
good. Go ahead.
Another definition of performance. How do you? I'm going to go back to the old critique about the anthropology, the gaze of anthropology.
Yes.
How do you guard against your presence in the class not turning the class into more of a performance than it would be
Yeah.
in your absence?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry about that.
No. Okay, so the first question, the performances and the boys. Surprisingly, this is what actually got me even more interested in these public performances, is the boys never performed. The boys, because they couldn't get the boys to do it. And the schools would get kind of directives from the Ministry of Education, you must have a performance for, Army Day at the municipality. Every performance I ever went to, with the exception of one, where there was a chorale from a university, which was co-ed, that came to sing, only had girls performing, only had girls reciting poetry, only had girls singing speeches, and there would be boys in the audience from boys' schools, but I never saw a male perform in the city that I was in. So to me, this performance was also, whether it was intentional or not, about sort of displaying women and displaying kind of developed women. It was because it's part of what the regime wants to present too. And again, I don't say this as kind of some explicit thing that boys were left out, but it fit very well into sort of the image of women and development and progress. The boys never participated. And when I asked, they said, oh, boys don't like to do that kind of thing, or they said, you know, it's hard to get the boys to like cooperate, basically. And I saw, there was a study about Mexico once, about these kind of performances in Mexico in schools. Bradley Levinson, I think it was, and he talks about the same thing, and he says the teachers said the same thing, that boys were too unruly to get them to do what we needed them to do at these performances. Okay, so the performance in class, yeah, no, I definitely try to tease out the kind of class dimensions of this, and in part that's why I did this research on vocational education and the history of vocational education as kind of a dumping ground for lower class kids in many parts of the world. You know, clearly there were, you know, this, the kind of educational background of their families, the resources of their families all sort of figured in their ability to do well in school. And there's also this kind of social promotion, which meant that many kids were in high school who couldn't even read. So it was just sort of a placeholder for them. And that kind of bias towards the different tracks, I think, really, I mean, my interpretation of it is very much that it has class. I mean, I don't know if people thought about it explicitly as class, but they thought about it as good family, bad family, but that had class dimensions to it. So not good in a kind of reputational sense, but these things are all tied up together, right? The morality and socioeconomic status and education, educated people are good. I mean, Hala Salaam has some great stuff about TV in Jordan, I mean, in Egypt, and like literacy programs, and how, you know, the villain is always sort of the uneducated, and the ways in which kind of moral upstanding goodness is associated with being educated. And I think this was implicitly at work all the time, and it very much had a class dimension to it. Oh, and the gaze. Yeah, it's something I thought about a lot, and I talk about it in the book a little bit. I mean, in the classrooms, I mean, there's no way to know for sure, right? But part of what I did is I spent, you know, 2 months just sitting in on classes day in, day out, getting people comfortable with me. And so, I mean, my hope is that sort of mitigated some of it, the fact that I was there all the time, and particularly because I ended up then spending a lot of time with particular teachers, 2 or 3 teachers. And I really would just kind of sit in the corner and often felt like people almost forgot I was there, but other times they engaged me. They'd say, what do you think about that? And they'd start engaging me in conversation. So I don't mean to deceive myself in any way by thinking that there weren't things that were said or said in a particular way because of my presence, but I think it was partly mitigated by just having been there a while, being more comfortable with me. And, you know, I have a connection to the community. You know, I'm from Jordan. My father-in-law was an educator in the city that I was in for 35 years. People were quite comfortable that I didn't have sort of some ulterior motive just because of these personal kinds of connections. So I speak Arabic like they speak Arabic, and a lot of things that I think just sort of facilitated a comfort level. I don't think that means that they acted exactly as they would without my presence, but I think some of that was mitigated. And, you know, I have a very funny story in the beginning where I talk about this, and I have this group of teachers that I used to hang out with because they had good coffee, and they would make me coffee, and I'd go see them once in a while, and they'd make me coffee. And one day they went outside under the trees and they were drinking coffee, and I, at the end of the conversation, took out my notebook and wrote something that I wanted to remember. And one of the teachers says, oh, there she goes with her notebook again. She'll probably tell them that all we do is drink coffee, and that's why we're not developed. So they were quite cognizant of sort of what was going on here. And I felt it's so silly taking out my notebook half the time because I would get these kind of remarks. Or another time they were telling kind of dirty jokes, and then they said, you better not write that in your notebook. And so I don't know. I was, part of the way I try to mitigate that in the text is also to try and frame everything, say, this is what happened, I asked this question, like to make it clear that I'm sort of instigating this or not, or whether this is an observation but yeah, you can't completely control for that, definitely. So, yeah, Sarah.
Did you find at all, because the sexes are completely segregated and there is this sort of like Islamic flavor to the education, did you follow any of the women to see what their success in the workplace was like afterwards? Since, I mean, I don't know if this is true, but I would get the sense that most of the directors and management at the companies would be male, but then the employees would be female. So how did they do in that sort of environment if they're sort of taught their place in Islamic society is this, and they don't have a lot of interaction with male superiors growing up?
I don't know that they're taught that their place is, I mean, I feel like this really varies. I mean, there are a lot of really strong women in that school, whether they were teachers or whether they were students. Now, having said that, there are a number of issues. One is, yes, there are fewer women in the workplace, and for women in this city, the issue is mobility too, right? So I have followed a lot of these young women, and in the city where they live, there are very few jobs, except public sector jobs, which are really hard to come by. And so if they really want to work, they need to leave their hometown, they need to go to the capital. Increasingly, that the commute to the capital has become more feasible because of better transportation and roads, but it's financially not very feasible unless you have a very lucrative job, so because it costs so much to get back and forth and they need to eat out. I've begun, and this is kind of separate from this project, but begun to do some research with women living in dormitories in the capital who come from cities like this or small towns, and they live in the capital so that they can work. And I did actually interview, and this is not data I've done anything with yet, but I interviewed a bunch of female engineers about their workplace experience, engineers at kind of different levels of experience. And I heard very different things. I mean, I heard from one young new engineer that she felt like a great deal of bias in the workplace, and she felt like her boss didn't want her there. And then I met like a 32-year-old who was like a manager over 30 men who said, look, you do your job right and nobody's going to question what you do. And then so I got very different stories, but there obviously are workplace issues. I mean, and women are continually struggling against all kinds of ceilings. And the main issues I saw with the adult women in my study is this kind of double burden, the domestic responsibilities, and most of the women I was working with are teachers and sort of trying to balance those responsibilities. And even some of the young women would say, why do I want to work? Look at how haggard my teacher is. Look at how, so there's, their most immediate model are their parents and the teachers around them. Having said that, I'm trying to think about some of the young women. Like one of the young women I know just went to Kuwait to teach English. And I have to say I'm kind of floored that her family is letting her go to Kuwait. But she was working at kind of a number of small part-time jobs but couldn't get a regular job. And now she's in Kuwait on a 2-year contract to teach English. Another young woman got married in her second year at the university, and I was really shocked. I mean, just to give you some different examples, because her mother had worked at like menial jobs. The father was kind of absent. She was like cleaning floors and selling bread out of her house and babysitting 10 kids and doing so many things. And not one of her brothers had passed the high school exam. She passed the high school exam, and her mother, using some of her connections, got her like some financial aid. And she went to university. She got married her sophomore year. And I was like, no, this was my initial reaction. And her brother was on Facebook, so I knew this. But then I get back 2 years later, and I find out that her mother sort of arranged this marriage so that this guy would pay for her to finish school, and she now just finished her master's degree, and he's also paid for that too. She has 2 kids. She's had 2 kids along the way too, and finished her master's degree. And the last time I saw her, she's like, my husband wants me to go do my doctorate. She's like, I'm so sick of school. And I'm just like trying to understand why. But she said, my husband left school when he was 14. And I said, so why does he want you to keep going to school? And she's like, he wants his wife to be educated. That's what she said to me. So there's some really weird kind of, I'm not saying that this is typical, but just saying that there's kind of other things associated with education that take on a life of their own. There are other girls who didn't pass, and they're either sitting at home or they got married. There's a real sense, and I don't know how to quantify that, but there's a real sense that if you don't graduate high school and you don't go to university, your marriage prospects decrease. And because in much the same way as people thought about university education for women here, education was about marrying up, right? And that was kind of the easiest way to improve your status, was to marry someone who was better off than your family was. Marry a doctor, marry an engineer, marry somebody in the royal family, So that's a bit distant, but so I don't know, just many unexpected things. So I've talked to one of the young women, posted something on Facebook the other day. She's working for an NGO with Syrian refugees. So she's been unemployed since she graduated, but now there's all this NGO work all of a sudden. Actually, 2 young women who graduated from the school have recently told me that they've gotten a kind of short-term gig working with a refugee agency. So it's sort of mixed. Another young woman didn't pass the high school exam, but didn't have the money to go to school, and her parents were just, her mother, she wasn't living with her father. The mother her famous quote was, oh, I just have to read you this quote, and then I'm going to stop because it's too long. Her mother's quote, let's see. Your husband is a diploma, gold, everything. So her mother, like she told me, oh, my mother thinks, who needs a diploma? Your husband is your diploma, your husband is your gold. And she was, she's one of 12 siblings. They're quite poor. They're living out on an abandoned farm. And so in her mother's perspective, getting married was the smartest thing to do. She passed the exam, but didn't have enough money to go to school. And one of her teachers, but then I lost track of what happened after this, was trying to find a potential spouse who would let her go to school and pay for her education. But my guess is that it didn't work, just from the indications I got. So there's just many different kind of stories. I mean, the woman who almost got engaged in 10th grade got married in 12th grade. She failed the exam, has 3 kids. I didn't see her, but her friend says, oh, she doesn't seem happy, but I don't know, so I don't know. There's many different, there's quite a bit of variety in what on the surface seems very homogeneous community. Like, it's just so many possibilities. Yeah. Yeah.
It's interesting that parents are so instrumental in securing their daughters' futures.
Yeah.
At the same time, teachers also have this sort of relationship. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between parents and teachers, and then how those expectations were communicated?
Yeah.
If that happened.
Like in this last case, the teacher was interceding because she saw this girl as someone with very few resources, even kind of family-wise. Her parents had gotten divorced, the mother had gotten remarried, there were 12 kids, and the situation was, so I think, so I don't know how the parents of that young woman perceived this kind of intercession on her part. And I tried, I asked teachers a lot about whether there were tensions between what they wanted for their students and what parents wanted, but often, for the most part, they were kind of on the same wavelength in terms of, they were of the community, the teachers too, so they sometimes might know each other quite well, actually. So these really were like community kind of projects sometimes, sort of what would happen. And the girls too are sort of instrumental, of course, right? They try to do really well, they try to convince their parents of this, they might try to get a teacher to intercede, but that might not always work. But no, I didn't explore that enough. I asked teachers about, do you feel like you have different goals for these girls than their parents do? And the parents also sort of typically thought of school as kind of an institution with shared goals.
And it's interesting to think that, sometimes families are often blamed for someone's potential, right? If you
Yeah.
go somewhere, it's because you were coming from a socioeconomic class.
Yeah.
That allowed you to go forward. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. All right. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.